Thank you for joining us. I'm Shannon Cardellina, and I'm pleased to have Dr. Mary Botticelli Christensen, the host of the new community-focused podcast, When the Pandemic Came to Town, How a Small New England Town Survived with Resilience and Kindness. Mary, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for this. I'm really excited.
And we are here to talk about the release of your podcast that you've been working on for quite some time. But before we get into the podcast itself, let's talk a little bit about you, your work, your time in Westborough. How did Mary come to town?
Well, Mary came to town as a parent because we lived in Connecticut for our whole entire lives, my husband and I, and all of our children migrated to the Boston area for graduate school. So they all settled here, and they kept saying, but Mom, it's a long drive to go home for holidays. Why don't you move up here with us? And so we did. And our oldest daughter, who lives in Grafton, was in charge of doing the reconnaissance of towns and places. And she came over to Westborough, and she, as almost a realtor style of explanation, that it's a quaint little New England town. I think you'll like it. It's very pretty. It has a green. She goes, you'll just love it. And it was only 15 minutes from her house, and so where our grandchildren are housed. So that was a big plus in how we got here. But what I left behind in Connecticut that I brought with me is a career-long passion and career in education. I started out as a high school English teacher, and then I became a college professor. And I was just so excited about teaching every day and learning new things. And so I brought that same passion here to Westborough, and I started a little company called Christensen's Educational Consulting, and now I have 22 clients that I'm teaching English as a second language or study skills or whatever they need. But I had an interesting encounter with a woman, Kathy Ferry-Ekia, who asked me if I could help her tell the story of Westborough during the pandemic. And she wanted me to write the foreword of a book she was hoping to do with pictures from around this time period. And I said, of course, I would love to, because at the time I was teaching a memoir class here at the library. And so she came to me, and I said, as soon as you're done. Then she came to me again and said, I really don't know how to do this, and I need your help. Would you take it over? And I said, yes, but I don't think a picture book is going to be the best way to tell this story. And that evolution came to the podcast, which is an audio documentary of the time of the pandemic. And we started, though, with the first pandemic that came to town, which was the Spanish flu. So that's how I drove up Route 90, up through, past Connecticut, and in a house I lived in 47 years, and downsized to a small townhouse with my best friend and husband, Burton. So that's how we got here.
That's amazing.
And it's been, and then the pandemic struck. So we didn't get to go out much or meet anyone or do anything. It was only a year, and then the pandemic hit. So now it's been a nice evolution to know so much about the town and met so many wonderful people.
So how long have you been collecting interviews and working on this project?
2.5 years.
Wow.
I started in just after the lifting of the lockdown. We wore masks, and the first groups that I contacted to speak with was the head of the public health department, since this was a crisis of health. And Dr. Ehrlich was very kind in talking to me at length about how the pandemic affected the town in a medical sense. And so that led me to asking other questions. And he would mention people, and it was really just pulling strings of information that people gave me to lead me to the next interview. And so that was the origins of it. But then I got interested in what happened with the first pandemic, because you can't find any information about it.
Right.
And so that was really the beginning of the longer version.
Okay.
And then one day, when I knew I couldn't afford to publish my own book, after doing many, many interviews, I walked into the Westborough TV studio and announced, do you folks do podcasts? And they were so gracious and so welcoming and set up a studio for us, and with, as they called it, NPR microphones. and they dealt for quite a number of months with a low-tech person trying to do a high-tech podcast. So I really appreciate them. And they were just wonderful. And they're assisting us again in getting the word out.
Right, absolutely. One of the things that I love that you've told me about yourself is that you always have ideas, and sometimes they're beyond your own skill set. So you're never afraid to ask for help. And that's sort of how we got here today, which is incredible. You started to talk a little bit about some of the different people that you've interviewed for this project. And what I thought was incredible is that it's almost impossible to create a comprehensive list. You talked to representatives from 17 faith groups, educators, parents, students, seniors, IT professionals, civic groups, business leaders. I mean, the list goes on and on. How did you decide who to interview for this project?
Well, having been a professor and doing a lot of research, you know how to take an idea and go through where the information you want, because every time you interview someone, questions come up in my mind and say, well, I want to know that. Why? And I'm new to the town. I think somebody else might want to know that. So I would find out the names of people. Who would be the person to talk to if you wanted to know about the tech, for example, and the schools. And I didn't know that there would be one for schools and one for town. And the amount of work they had to do just to keep everybody up to date with technology was just amazing. Or then going through the departments in the town manager, which led me to a whole host of folks, meeting people in the select board, meeting the superintendent. As an educator, that was an important part for me. And I wanted representatives who could speak to that area. So after we did all the townspeople and when we were putting the episodes together, I wanted to have certain people to be in there as well from the community. So we have a middle school girl at the time who wrote a fascinating poem and very provocative in terms of her understanding of how this COVID crept into the town and took everything away from her. And then to a high school student who had just graduated and his junior and senior years were taken up by COVID. To a few teachers who were instrumental in getting programs for their families who were at risk for either food insecurities or, and then that led me to faith-based groups. And having been brought up in a parochial school, I knew the importance of faith-based groups in molding and putting together a community. So I thought, this is a little town. How many faith-based groups could there be? And I was determined not to leave anyone out. And I was just delighted to meet the fabulous people in town, from the folks at the mosque to the folks at the temple, the Jewish temple, to the Baptist church, the Lutheran church. It was just wonderful. And I got a tour of their places of worship, which really ignited me in that other part of the title. Because I started out with when the pandemic came to town. And then I figured the research and where it led would tell me what the rest of that sentence should be. And so in talking to all of these people, either synonyms or the actual words of resilience and kindness kept coming out in everyone's conversation. And so that's when I started to see that that's really what the town was about. That's how they really survived. So I even went out and had a lovely chat at the farm of the nurse family. And they talked about their resilience of still running a farm that's 300 years old. But also, that's what really baked in that sense of resilience in a town. It's been 300 years of farmers and people coming in when the different, the trolley came, and then there were factories, and then automobiles came in, and then there were, right now, 120 different corporations and research and all kinds of things going on in the town. You have to be resilient in order to keep up with the changes and yet still hold on to what my daughter calls the quaint New England feel.
Absolutely. So you find this recurrent thread of resilience and kindness through all of these interviews with people from different walks of life. And so as you're putting this together, what do you start to feel is the most exciting part about being able to share this podcast with our community, or maybe what surprised you the most?
Well, first of all, how welcoming they were to participate. Mm-hmm. The hardest part to get them to participate is that I still have a Connecticut cell phone number. And so I was assumed to be spam when I would contact people, because someone would give me their number and say, you should call them. Mm-hmm. And then I realized when I was not getting callbacks that they must assume that I am spam and trying to sell them real estate or something. And so I had to ask that original person, would you identify me? Then I'll be calling them, and then immediately I would be included in their phone calls, because I was feeling very left out because no one would return my calls. But then they all said the same thing. Oh, I thought you were just spam. And so that was surprising how everyone wanted me to talk to someone else. Mm-hmm. No one wanted to really take the spotlight for themselves. They said, oh, you have to talk to Mary Tabor. She's at the foundation, and I had to learn where the foundation was and everything. Or you have to talk to the folks at the group that was part of the COVID task force. And so they give me their list. Mm-hmm. And so when I wasn't teaching my students in the evening, I was doing all of this research and finding people and chatting with them on the phone to kind of get a feel for how they would feel about doing this. And at first, as I said, I'm low tech, and I worked in a university where we had a huge tech department. So whenever I got a high tech idea, I just called them. Well, now I know I have high tech people here that I can call. And in particular, Aiden and Karen and Jeff, and of course, I became very attached to Pixel, the dog. So I think I make unintentional, unannounced visits just so I can see Pixel.
I'm surprised we don't have her
I was thinking of it. Yes, I would like her to get a little attention.
So you discussed a little bit about how the concept of historical documentation was one of the early ideas behind this project. But beyond making a record, why do these interviews matter now? Like, why should we make the time to listen to this podcast? Because I know some of us feel like we're just recovering from the pandemic. We're just starting to, return to quote unquote normal life. So what is in this podcast that we all need beyond that historical documentation?
Well, the first part of that question is that when I was doing the research about the previous pandemic, I found very little. Mm-hmm. One little article, nothing in depth about what happened, much less in the country, but in Westborough. Mm-hmm. And I became very enamored of the town clerk's office and the archives in the library with those folks, because they were showing me all of their documents. And it was very scarce to have the story, which would have been a little bit of a help to those of us today going through it. But there was nothing other than that they had arguments about wearing masks. And so I thought, well, people don't change. Things still, some things are the same. And so fortunately, we have a historical society here who happened to be giving a lecture, sponsoring a lecture with a professor from Fitchburg who wrote a book on the Spanish flu. Wow. And so I contacted him, and as most professors, we don't make a lot of money. And so even if you have books out there. So I said, the first thing I said, I have no money to offer you, but I'd love to have you in the podcast. And he said, I love it. I love the whole idea. So he brought that knowledge to the podcast. And then the Historical Society, Kathy Cavallari, came on and told what life was like in Westborough at that time. And her presentation, she said, could I just read my narrative instead of asking questions? And I went, oh, the voices, that's what's important. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be just a conversation. And so I institute a in your own words part. And that enticed some people who were very hesitant to want to talk on radio, or even necessarily, it's not something everyone is comfortable in doing. And so it became in their own words. And we had so many people willing to come up and read poems or stories or pieces that they had written to their congregation during that time, that it added a nice texture of the history.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I realized that, yes, everyone kept saying, why are we doing this? It's just happened. We want to take a break. I didn't want them to forget, after hearing all these wonderful stories about this kindness and resilience, what we're really made of as human beings, that if we come together as, the original idea of a tribe and coming together to survive, we could do anything. But it was really for the future, because there's going to be something else that happens, catastrophic or medical or, another natural occurrence like the earthquakes or blizzards. There's going to be something that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no record of how or who should come together, because Christy Williams, as the town manager, pulled together a team of everyone she thought she needed to have in the conversation. And then that expanded, just the way the podcast did, to, and you really should get these people in. And these people need to have a say. And that's how it built itself out. And it's really, that's why there's this piece about the future, because what lessons learned? Did you do any? And one of the people in the town hall had said to me that it's best to always have strong relationships with your vendors, a really relationship, not just sending in a check. And because when there are 1,000 people trying to get a Zoom agreement and you do a lot of business with them, you have their ear first. And he said that made all the difference. But with others that they hadn't done that, it was like waiting, trying to get vital pieces of technology that they were going to need. So that's an important lesson, even for everyday workday. Make connections, be resilient, be kind, keep it going, play it forward, because we're going to have another one of these. Probably not in my lifetime, but hopefully, because I don't, really want to. And I wasn't here for the Spanish flu, just in case anyone was wondering. But I do want to make sure that the future. And as a teacher, I'm rooted in the present. I have to research the past of, I was an English professor and an English teacher and an education professor. So finding out the history of things is important. But I'm teaching people, especially young people, who are going to take me into the future. So that's how I view everything. It's got to be partly in the present, this documentary, building on the past, and then shouting it out to the future to try this, do this, listen to this. And so that's what I'm hoping for this. It's actually been a joy, because I met all of these people. And now when I go to the library, there are people there who say, "Oh, hi, Mary." And I was like, I feel like I'm a part of the town. And so the last part of the podcast is a little epilogue for me about how this resident changed because I did think it was a little odd when I moved here. The town, it was very quaint, but it didn't have very many traffic lights, coming from a suburb, that's got it, not quite so rural, and that there was an ordinance that farm animals had the right of way on all roads. And I was like, a city kid, what is going on here? But then when I saw how many trucks get stuck under the bridge and the cars are backed up, I just said, now this is odd. And so, but now it's become odd as a marker of the town. You keep track of how many trucks, and the truck is always going to lose and the bridge is always going to win. And so it becomes a bonding thing. Did you hear the truck hit the bridge again? So that's my feeling now, that I am a part of the community, and that at least a few people know my name.
Sure. Well, I think that listening to you talk about this, I think one of the things that I'm hearing is that the community was really able to bring together great critical thinkers, incredible caregivers, and it instilled a pride of place and that true sense of community in an emergency. And I think all of us want to know that we live in a community where we have that. We're in it together, and we're going to take care of each other and put our best foot forward.
Right. And it's the small things that we don't think about that are really so emotionally uplifting. One of the, and this is a very young man, and he said, you know, when I would come in the morning and see all those little rocks that someone had painted saying, think of you, thinking of you, keep it up, you know, he said it really had an effect on me. And someone else who said, you know, this is from the pandemic. I actually had to get a chance to have lunch with my children during the school day. And so those little moments that we should try to incorporate into our future lives, that having rituals now where everyone was doing puzzles in the family in the evening because they didn't, you know, they were busy with school and they were busy working. And now they said, we need to do something. We can't go anywhere. Let's do puzzles.
What a lovely way to look at something that was in many ways devastating and heartbreaking for a lot of people, but there were good things that came out of it. And some of it was that simplicity, right? The kind messages to one another and the time spent with family. So what do you see your role in Westborough, in our community, beyond the podcast?
Well, I have some ideas. As an English teacher, and I have started designing and working with a small committee to create Westborough's literary magazine. And I had so many people who had written things during the pandemic that they shared on air, and many, many more who we couldn't put on unless you wanted to listen to it for 3 years, and we had to select, that they were important stories. And so having done that with my college students and with my high school students, having a journal that they could publish, either the college kids or a journal for the high school kids and the college kids, I thought, why not have something that would be free to pick up at the library, collecting them. And so the working name right now is the ampersand, where the writer and the reader meet.
I think that sounds like a very exciting project. We look forward to seeing how that develops, but let's talk a little bit more about the podcast and where people will be able to listen to it. How many episodes did you put together?
There were 12 episodes where the town and the townspeople are in, and then I did a prologue and an epilogue. So there's 14 episodes, about an hour, and you should listen very carefully for a little boy and his dad reading from quotes from a book called Rabbit and Bear Make a Wish by Tara Shannon. And it's a beautiful book, and she gave us permission, and it's available on Amazon to use it. And it was all about fear and resilience. And so Bear says, and there's the father doing the bear, and the 8-year-old or 10-year-old boy is doing the rabbit. And he says, Bear, I'm afraid. And Bear says to him, don't worry, I'll be sitting right next to you until you're not afraid. And there's passages like that throughout the podcast, just reminding us that we're not alone. And maybe sometimes we feel like children and we need a bear to just say, it's going to be okay. Right. And so I just thought that was a real gold mine find. You know, it's one of those little things that hits you and you go, I need to put this in. And it's just goes by quickly, but it's really beautiful.
Well, and I think that's a wonderful summary for your podcast too, because what it illuminates for all of us is that within this community, there's so many people sitting right next to us to get us through those hard times.
Yes, and for me it was the TV studio and my husband. And by the way, family, I came all the way up here for you. And my son moved to Germany for 3 years, and my daughter bought a house in Sharon. So I don't know if that reflects on me or that life has I've taught them to go follow their bliss. But yes, we came here and now I feel at home. So we're not moving.
Wonderful. Well, to listen to Mary's podcast, it is available on Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a wonderful opportunity to hear about the work that you've done and what an incredible community we live in.
Yes, and thank you so much. This was delightful. And keep your eye open for ampersand.
We absolutely will. Thank you, Mary.